And hello, and welcome to this episode of Countercurrents. I'm Larry Johnson. Today, speaking with Ian Proud, a proud British diplomat who served in Moscow, I believe, between 2014 and 2019. Watched firsthand the start of the war in the Maidan. He brings both firsthand experience and wisdom to this discussion. So I encourage you to please hit the like and subscribe button and enjoy our conversation. And we'll get started. Hey, so growing up, did you ever have a complex in school? Because with the name Proud, right off the bat, you think, the teachers are going to assume you have an attitude because you are proud.
Yeah, right. I mean, everybody used to say to me, "Oh, you must be so proud of yourself," as if it was the first time you said that freaking joke.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but actually, I came from a very working class background. So you think proud must be some high society thing. Quite the opposite. My dad was from a coal mining village in the northeast of England, and my mum worked by the docks in Southampton.
So how did you make your way into the foreign ministry?
So I had an odd, I suppose, entry because I was a weenie kid, only grew when I hit puberty when I was about 15, I think. That's what it felt like at the time. I got bullied in school. I sort of bummed out of college. I didn't actually do my degree. I started work age 18. But then I got a bit bored with that and I thought, well, I'd better get a degree. And luckily I worked for the police in Hampshire and they actually sponsored me to study for a degree part-time, which I did while working as a civilian for the police, doing internal affairs, basically, studying dodgy cops. So I did that for a bit, sailed through my degree, did really well with that. And on a punt, I thought, well, I'll have a go at this diplomatic thing, this kind of graduate entry. They call it the fast stream in the UK. I don't know if you have a similar system in the State Department and so on. And miraculously, after a year, I got in. And actually, I always kind of thank Bill Clinton because when I did my main assessment board up in London, it was a 2-day residential thing. I'd chosen weapons inspections in Iraq, and it was 1998, late 1998. It was at the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, if you remember that time, when Clinton authorized Tomahawk cruise missile strikes on Iraq at the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So that was my topic, and I was up all night studying. I think, thank God for that. And I sort of did the sell for the interview, and I always said that Monica Lewinsky got me the job. So there you are.
Well, at least you did something productive, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes. But I left, thankfully, no stay.
Now, how did you snag the posting in Moscow? That was what, 2014?
Yeah, right. I'd actually, interestingly, I've been to Moscow just once in 2016 when I was actually working out in Thailand. Running the UK presidency of the sort of G8 in 2005. And a big priority was the counter-terrorism work, document identity kind of fraud. And Russia was to be the president of the G8 in 2006. And I got invited to what was called a counter-terrorism action group meeting in February of 2006. And I don't know if you've been to Bangkok during your sort of previous career.
Yeah,
but,
I was there in 1991.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So did you like it?
I remember the Chaupraya River as being like a boiling river of chocolate milk with some parsley thrown in.
Exactly. That's a very good way to describe it.
The traffic.
And you'll also remember the average daily temperature of about 36 degrees Celsius with about 90% humidity. Well, go from that with no winter clothes to minus 20 in Moscow in February. So after that, so basically, I snagged a job in 2012 to kind of organize the G8 summit in 2013 in Northern Ireland, right? David Cameron was Prime Minister. And it was actually Vladimir Putin's last ever visit to the UK. And for that summit, Obama was there too. I met Obama. And at that time, so UK-Russia relations were going through one of their periodic good patches, good with a small g, to make that clear. Russia would be the presidency of the G8 again in 2014. And this job came up. I thought, gosh, I better do that. I could get to go to 2 G8 summits in 2 years. And of course, the rest is history, as they say. I rocked up in the summer of 2014, having waited 10 months for my diplomatic visa. And, the rest, as they say, is history.
So, why is there such animosity between London towards Moscow as opposed to, because, as an observer of this, not nearly with your experience and background, but I keep looking for sort of the, if you will, the casus belli.
Yeah.
And, it'd be one thing if Russia was behaving like the quintessential bully on the block, walking down the street, pushing kids out of wheelchairs, knocking old women over, putting their hands on some guy's girlfriend, that kind of behavior, be reprehensible and you take action. But it seems that almost not just Britain, but the United States have been looking for a reason to be angry. Well, how's your take?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's been long historical, suspicion, competition, between Britain and Russia, going right back to the Great Game in Central Asia and all those kind of fun and games in the kind of 18th and 19th century, and so on, and Crimea War and all the rest of it, the first one anyway. And I think it just it's like one of those herpes viruses that kind of lives in your system and you think it's disappeared for a while. And every now and again, you get really stressed and it reappears. And I think it's kind of like that. There's an inbuilt, innate, kind of hidden away in a lot of people, Russophobia, which they don't really necessarily understand themselves. Most of them have probably never even been to Russia, probably met very few, Russian people, and it just springs up. And of course, back in the end of 2013, when dodgy Yanukovych was getting ready for the Vilnius summit on the sort of Eastern Partnership, the association agreement he was meant to sign but didn't sign. That just kind of, the whole Russian thing erupted again. And part of it, of course, is also driven, by the media, which I think is hardwired in the UK to kind of take a Russia skeptical sort of position. It all became it's very personalized. It all became about, well, this is really about Putin. Putin has these kind of big grand plans to sort of take over Ukraine. And it all kind of really started then, all the kind of negative headlines. Don't let Putin win. I mean, this was just like about an economic deal. It was about a trade deal, really, between, the Ukraine and the EU. And it got blown completely out of proportion. Medvedev kind of steps in, as Putin's front man and offers Yanukovych 15 billion. And at the time, the EU was offering peanuts to Ukraine to kind of, sign this association agreement. Medvedev comes in with 15 billion in, tranches of 3 billion at a time. And Yanukovych says, thanks very much. I'll stick with you. And that's, that, and of course, with the whole Maidan thing, erupts, everybody's kind of blaming some dreadful, Putin, and he's got this grand plan that the coup happens, all the stuff that people that probably watch Russia know about, already. And, the whole kind of thing comes to sort of a roiling, kind of bubbling, chocolate covered, tropical river, but hotter than that still, of hatred. And, you see that really from, Philip Hammond becoming Foreign Secretary in the summer of 2014 to today, the really hardline UK position. That was worsened, of course, when the UK left out of this thing called the Normandy format, which, this idea that François Hollande of France came up with Angela Merkel to get Putin and Poroshenko at the time, the Ukrainian president, in some peace dialogue. We were flat-footed and left out of that. And that just made matters worse because, we didn't have a role all of a sudden. So our role became flag bearer of sanctions. And, that's really kind of how we got to the position today where Russia is the most sanctioned country on the planet by a very long way. Like 15 times more even than Iran. And
doing quite well.
Very well, economically, yeah.
Whereas England, the United Kingdom, not so much. You guys are having some economic turmoil, might be a polite way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the economy is not bad in the UK, but we've got massive, amounts of debt. Part of that, of course, is a hangover from COVID and all the kind of support that went into that. But yeah, we've got huge debt. We can't ever stick within budget. We're having to sort of increase taxes. We're still, having said all of this, managing to pump billions into Ukraine every year to fund their war. But somehow, having said, the really controversial thing that happened last month where, they cut a winter fuel allowance for old people. Old
I
people
saw that.
It's a small 100, 300 pounds a year, not a massive amount, but still when you're in your 70s and you're on your pension and it's winter time, then that makes a big difference, right? So they cut this and that, of course, they never conflate the issues. They never, or should I say, they take great steps to avoid the possibility of people linking that to the massive amounts of military aid we give to Ukraine. They just don't allow that kind of conversation, those two threads of conversation to come together. We'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And by the way, we're cutting pensioners' winter fuel payments. I personally find it quite bizarre, but that just shows the power of the deep state and, its control over the media narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of political move would qualify as imbecilic. I mean, in the past, the Democrats in America would always vilify the Republicans for pushing grandma in the wheelchair off the cliff, and this is the actual equivalent of that. And I thought this was like a Monty Python bit resurrected to have labor pushing a policy to cut off the funding for keeping the old people warm. Are you kidding?
Yeah, right. But it's true, and nobody ever, in the mainstream media says, well, Ukraine is losing this war. $5 billion a year, if you include all the bells and whistles that are attached to the kind of military aid package. Is that actually going to make a difference? You never get any conversation about this. It's quite bizarre. Wind fuel payments. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, it looks like, at least with respect to the relationship between the United States and Zelensky, that thing's starting to unravel a bit. I don't know if you saw. So Zelensky, in the last few days, he's been on what I call sort of a cocaine rage. So,
he's been a loose cannon because he's desperate, right?
Yeah. He's been yelling at India and China and Brazil. Then he started yelling at India yesterday or day before yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that.
And then today he's yelling at Biden administration because they leaked his request to get Tomahawk cruise missiles so he could start World War III.
Yeah, no, I saw that too. I saw that. There's just this massive sense of entitlement, isn't there? That, actually, that he has options, and an option is actually to negotiate. And if you look at the battlefield, position now, it's far worse for him than it was in March 2022.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not going to get any better. And however much aid he gets from the West, he will never get as much as he had from the West in 2022. Because slowly people are diminishing their contributions. They're still giving him crumbs here and there. The US just given another $800 billion in the past few days. But, military aid peaked in 2022 and is on a sort of terminal downward trajectory. And that's not going to change. His losses will continue to, mount up. At some point, he's got to ask himself whether actually, rather than blaming everybody else, he could sit down and actually negotiate a ceasefire to start a long overdue peace process. What that means for him is, let's face it, he can't go back to comedy. Is actually kind of a political end of the road, probably, because he'd then have to submit himself to democratic elections.
Yeah. What about Zaluzhny, General Zaluzhny, is he or is he not Ukraine's ambassador in London?
He is. Yeah.
Does he have much of a presence?
Well, I mean, he accompanied Keir Starmer, was it, to Kiev, on a visit, so which I thought was interesting. But he's a military person, and my job was in the army. Big respect to anybody who serves in the military. Sort of, big love for anybody in the armed forces, but they're not actually trained diplomats, right? I mean, his job is to kind of show up support for weapon supplies, and that's really his purpose there, right? He's got status. I mean, you have to be honest and say actually the Ukrainian defense was far better than anybody could possibly have imagined, back in 2022. He's got to take a lot of credit for that. He has stature as somebody who stood up at that time. And he's a very credible character in Whitehall because of that.
Well, and it seems that his name's been floated before as a replacement for Zelensky, and he is at least, in terms of public opinion polls, far more popular than Zelensky. And he was quoted, I think, if it wasn't early this week, late last week, admitting that, look, we, the Ukrainians, we're going to have to make some concessions to the Russians. We can't go back to 1991. That's not happening. So he appeared to be at least have a grasp on some reality, and so that's why I'm wondering: is he? So he's in good odor there in the UK.
Oh yeah, I mean he's Ukrainian, so I mean it's not. To be honest, it's not a high bar to jump here right now. But nevertheless, he does have stature because of what he's done, and you have to give credit to Ukraine for the way they have held out against Russia since the start of the war, and he has to take a lot of credit for that. So he has huge stature here, and a willing, frankly, audience.
So let me take you back to 2014. There you are in Moscow. And we'll put a link to your book, Moscow Misfit, is it? Is that the correct title?
Misfit in Moscow. Yeah.
Misfit in Moscow. Explain why you chose that title. What made you a misfit?
Well, because, as you kind of alluded to at the start, there's a fairly fixed kind of British position on Russia. And the Foreign Service, the diplomatic service in the UK, has an inbuilt sort of tendency to kind of group think. Nobody wants to step out and take a different perspective on what's happening, particularly in the context in 2014 of having a new minister, Philip Hammond, who became foreign minister just days before I landed in Moscow, who had a totally hardline position on Russia. We shouldn't talk to Russia. We should talk about Russia to everybody else, but we should minimize direct dialogue with Russia because that would effectively legitimize a totally ridiculous, proposition. You should talk to your foes more than you talk to your friends, in some way, like hugging them closer and all that sort of thing. Well, he said, well, let's have no dialogue at all. And of course, I said, well, actually, does that really make sense? Shouldn't we, now of all times, be engaging with dialogue for the very reason that we have these kind of massive, globally sort of relevant, challenges facing us, specifically an increasingly hot conflict, on the fringes, of Europe. And of course, that then carved me out as a misfit, not sort of going along with the party line. And I suppose that's why I got the title.
Hey, have you been back to Russia, Moscow at all since 2019?
No, sadly not. I'd hoped to go this year for a conference around Victory Day, but I had to change my passport. That didn't work out, so I'm looking to go now. I'd love to go back next year. Actually, I really would, just to kind of see it again, maybe talk to some old contacts and that sort of thing. I think I'm still in touch with Russian friends. I mean, friends are friends, right? I mean, some of whom I violently disagree on certain issues. So I'm not hard over supportive of Russia and the actions it's taken. I'm just kind of somebody who recognizes the mistakes that we in the West have made to create this, dreadful situation we're in today. But I keep in touch. I'd definitely love to go back next year if I possibly can. It's Moscow in the summer is a great place to be.
I made my first trip last December. I arrived on a day that they described as record-breaking snowfall.
Yeah.
And I was amused by it because, my impression was that the Russians were used to this, these bitter winters with, when they had snow, we'd be talking 1 meter or 2 meters worth of snow.
Yeah.
Well, this was 5 inches of snow, not much.
December's a bit early, in fairness.
Yeah, but they were, oh my God, we've had this record-breaking snow. I just laughed because I pulled out a picture from where I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, where we had close to a meter of snow and 8 years ago. So I said, that's record breaking. Okay. This is nuisance. But the visit to Moscow destroyed every stereotype I had going in.
I bet it did.
Modern. I only saw 2 policemen the entire time I was there. Normally I'd spent some time in Bogota, Colombia back in, say 2000, 2001. So back then you had our military patrols on every street corner with armored cars, the blindados. So there was always a security presence there in your face. Here I'm looking around and it's like, and I wasn't getting, I didn't pick up any surveillance. I've run counter surveillance courses. Actually, ran one in October of 2016 at Lord's Cricket Ground for a bunch of Eastern European journalists, and I had a bunch of former Scotland Yard blokes who had worked the Northern Ireland issues. And I got to say, London is a hoot. If you're going to do counter surveillance operations, what a fun place from that standpoint. Indeed. But my point was
a lot easier than in Moscow, right, where it's much more homogenous.
Well, as an example, we went down to Red Square. So it's Red Square. It's in the winter. You tell me how you're going to do surveillance on somebody who's wearing a winter coat with a stocking cap on, unless you can put like a chem light on them so you can keep track of them. Because it's all these people. But it was, relaxed, prosperous. I went into some of the stores. It was, I don't know. Do you know Alistair Crook?
No, I don't actually. I should reach out to him. But, I know of him, obviously.
I was there with Alistair and his wife, Aisling. And so we needed to exchange some money. And it was like late in the day. It was like 7:00 in the evening. And we went to the concierge. We were staying at the Intercontinental Hotel. And Alistair, he'd had a leg injury, so he sat down. So Aisling and I went, according to the concierge, said, "Oh, go to the bank next door." And we go, "The bank? Well, it's 7:00 at night." Well, apparently the Russians have never heard of banking hours, because we got in there and that place was jumping. And we had to take a number and waited, 45 minutes just to try to exchange some money. And it wasn't because you had one clerk behind a desk and, a queue of 50 people. I mean, every desk was full. All these bankers were working and people getting loans for this and to buy. I mean, and I thought, wow, you don't see that in the United States.
Yeah, and I suppose partly that's because they're going to cut off from lots of international financial transaction systems, so more people have to physically go into banks now. But Intercon's in quite a nice location, if I recall, quite close to the centre.
Yeah,
to a Skyway, if I remember correctly.
Right.
Lovely part of town there.
And so, but I came away saying, boy, this destroyed the stereotype. So when you were in Moscow in 2014 and watching the events unfold in Kiev, in the Maidan, did you have any inkling or understanding at the time that this was basically a Western-backed intelligence operation, or?
I mean, that's been obvious right from the start, right? Without getting into too many details, but I mean, Victoria, as soon as they kind of tapped Victoria Nuland's phone call with "Bye," that was a real clincher, right? So I mean, none of these points are disputed, right? I mean, Victoria Nuland was actively engineering to get Yatsenyuk into the role as Prime Minister while negotiations were ongoing with Yanukovych. That's even been recorded on tape. Yanukovych flees, he gets shot at, and suddenly, the Verkhovna Rada passes this kind of vote, which is lower than the kind of constitutional requirement to oust Yanukovych, and they usher in a new prime minister, and within a couple of months, Poroshenko's president. So I mean, none of these things are disputed. Nuland has never made any secret of this, apologized for her role in it. She's quite, brazen, frankly, in being upright and believing that what she did was correct. So that was that. I mean, the Russians call it a coup. Whichever way you look at it, it would be hard at the very least to say that kind of, the US, the UK, and other European governments kind of very much backed this unconstitutional move.
Well, what's interesting is the timing of this, because
why was the timing better? I mean, things were really bubbling up in the Maidan, right?
Yeah,
and it's getting to a real, crunch point. People were literally getting shot at, and of course, there's a growth of the thing that you seldom hear about. So I'm just going to grab my coffee.
Yep.
The thing that you seldom hear about is, in addition to the kind of the Euro Maidan, as some people call them, kind of movement, there's also a significant body of pro-Russian protesters as well. You never really hear about those in the Western press. But what actually happened was that clashes between both groups were mounting in intensity, and the police was increasingly unable to deal, with the situation, people getting shot at, and the Europeans mounted a kind of peace mission, actually, working actually with Russia, on that, and get agreement for Yanukovych to go. And of course, that then forces the Americans' hands, because essentially, kind of the Europeans have stepped in on your turf, or people like Nuland consider to be, their turf, and have brokered this deal for Yanukovych to leave voluntarily by no later than November of 2014. And so, something had to give, because actually that wasn't really the kind of the playbook that Nuland had in mind when she wanted something more much quicker to happen, i.e. Yanukovych exit stage left as soon as possible, and everything then unfolded as we know that it did.
And weren't the Olympics underway in Sochi at the time too?
The Olympics carried on while this was happening, and actually kind of as they'd been described, the little green men actually moved in on Crimea bloodlessly, has to be said, just a couple of days after the Olympics finished. So Putin, wanted to have an untroubled Olympics. If you bear in mind that actually the Olympics were taking place only a couple of punch clicks from Crimea,
right.
So the Maidan stuff was all happening while the Olympics was going on. People like John McCain and Eva Hofstadt were coming along, giving people cakes, talking to the crowd, and all that sort of crap. But actually, kind of Russia made its move on Crimea just a few days after the Olympics had finished.
Of course, Russia back then was not in the kind of military shape that it is now, correct? In terms of,
it certainly wasn't as hardened as it was now. But let's not forget that Russia had been engaged quite closely in Syria, before that. A totally different context, obviously. But I don't think it'd be correct to say that it was in bad shape. It still had a total kind of complement of over 1 million, people, including kind of reservists. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily in bad shape. It hadn't been hardened by battle or conventional battle beyond the support it provided to Syria, but definitely, an effort had been underway since around 2010, 2011 to really improve its performance on the back of what had been considered at the time a pretty poor performance in its, short war with Georgia in 2008.
Right.
Where it was, even though the whole thing was done and dusted within the space of about 12 days, I think, from bang to sort of finish, the operation was considered to have been quite a poor sort of performance in terms of showing the weaknesses in Russian military capabilities. That then, the global financial crisis then ensued. That got out of the way. There's a kind of big surge to kind of spend masses more on the Russian military to kind of modernize it.
Mm-hmm.
And that process of modernization with kind of huge yearly increases in military expenditure from about 2010, 2011 onwards was still ongoing, of course, when 2014 came along. And yes, I mean, obviously, the Russian military probably hadn't been tested, was still reforming, sort of growing, getting more modern, kit, but it was still a kind of formidable force just in terms of the density of it. And some of the systems, I mean, like they already had at that time S-300, S-400. Some of their capabilities were nevertheless still very good. They'd already designed the Armata tank, still hasn't been seen in action. The Su-57 and those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, war in Ukraine has obviously sharpened it after a pretty poor start, of course, in February 2022.
Yeah, it seems that I thought that Russia didn't go all in to Syria until after the Olympics. It was in 2014, late 2014, that Syria finally made the request. And it was always, I think, in that context that Russia looked at the West was out of control in terms of trying to interfere in the affairs of other countries, and always using the excuse that it was Russia and China who were busy meddling like the incorrigible mother-in-law.
Indeed.
But so that was sort of, I think, Russia's first line in the sand. Do you recall at the embassy at the time in Moscow how it was Russia's action moving into Syria was being viewed? Was this seen as did that warrant any kind of statement from Her Majesty's government at the time?
I mean, it became our top foreign policy party with Russia, Syria, because we didn't really have a direct bilateral relationship with Russia. Syria became the issue on which we had things to talk about with Russia, even though they didn't feel they had things to talk about with us because we weren't actually materially engaged in Syria because of the parliamentary vote in 2013 not to kind of get involved militarily. So it became a big priority, for us. We're incredibly suspicious of what Russia was, trying to do. Some of their kind of quite sort of kinetic, tactics they're using sort of on the ground there. But it was a very complicated landscape, right? I mean, the Americans were all, the Turkish were involved. I mean, the French were, closely involved. I mean, so many countries were engaged. I mean, there was a time, I don't know if you remember, when actually the French and the Russians agreed to work together in Syria for a brief period of time. I think that was around sort of early 2015. Perhaps it was a massively kind of confusing and complex, picture, and where the European countries positioned themselves changed dramatically as a kind of Syria refugee crisis really unfolded.
How do you account for the abysmal intelligence? No, I know you can't speak to. I'll speak to the American side, but it appears that the British side isn't much better. And when I'm speaking of intelligence, I'm talking about both the let's call it the open communication from Embassy Moscow back to either London or Washington D.C. in terms of saying, "Hey, here's what we as political officers or consular affairs or econ officers." Here's what we're seeing. Here's the reality of Russia. And then on the intelligence side of the house, to be so dead ass wrong about Russia's capabilities, about Russia's vulnerabilities. I mean, it's really stunning. Is this deliberate sabotage, or people just suddenly become stupid?
I think from my perspective, it's really kind of not recognizing the extent of Russian resolve, to act, and estimating, overestimating our ability to kind of constrain, through policies such as sanctions, hybrid warfare, and those sorts of things. So we underestimate them, we overestimate our capabilities, essentially. And underlying that is a kind of fairly, fixed, even today, position that we're not going to fight Russia over Ukraine. But nevertheless, a really kind of strong political sentiment that actually we should limit all kind of engagement with Russia. You end up in this, confusing sort of Gordian knot where, we have a policy that isn't really kind of delivering anything substantive to actually improve the situation. But if you say that, you're offering advice that ministers don't want to hear. Whether that's intelligence reporting, whether it tends to be quite tactical anyway, or sort of more strategic kind of advice.
Yeah, so you've experienced that too, where you're told, oh, they don't want to hear that down. The expression when I was out at CIA, they don't want to hear that downtown.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, ministers were just not in the market for viewpoints or perspectives that were different, from their own. And so therefore, things like intelligence just gets very, very sort of tactical in its focus. It provides information, but all the kind of filtering of that, making sense of that, sort of projecting forward, from that goes through a very political lens. And it always ends up as, well, let's carry on doing what we're already doing.
Yeah.
Invariably, yeah. If you see what I mean.
I've in my private fantasy have wished that every government could have sort of I call it the office of the Dutch uncle. So where the Dutch uncle is going to be the one, that'll be the one place you go where you get the truth told to you, even though it may be unpleasant, uncomfortable, or unwelcome.
Yeah, exactly. And this all actually, ironically, goes back to Iraq, believe it or not. And, we've got this thing called the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK, which filters all the available intelligence, material from all over, all the different sources that are available, of that. And it provides these, very kind of crystallized bits of analysis, and insight on particular topics. And it's actually, really, really kind of useful tool and quite rigorous in how it kind of does its work. But that model became really discredited and undermined, during the Iraq, basically after 9/11.
Right.
I'd actually been in Pentagon just day before 9/11. I flew back to the UK on the night of 9/10. Got back into the office on the red eye in time to kind of watch it unfold. I was then involved in looking at the intelligence dossier from the UK side, after 9/11, in the kind of, as it's being kind of pulled together. And there's a historic moment, I don't know if you can remember this or be aware of it, from the US side, where the Prime Minister's, Tony Blair's communications, director tells the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee that the dossier isn't sexy enough. And it has to be sexed up to kind of, give the Prime Minister the kind of political width he needs to actually then justify coming in with George W. Bush in terms of military engagement in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of politicization of intelligence and analysis, actually you can trace it back to 2001, in the aftermath of 9/11. And so now, JICS, Joint Intelligence Committee, still exists, still does what it does, but there's still that sense that actually at any time, somebody from, the government, the political side of the house can come along and say, well, actually, is that, that's not really hitting where the Prime Minister, wants to kind of be at, with the analysis. And that's how things unfold, believe it or not. It seems remarkable.
See, I had penned an op-ed along with Milt Bearden. Milt had been the CIA chief in charge of the Afghan project, and during when we were trying to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And so we joined up to write an op-ed that was published on Election Day in 2000. And in that, we said that whoever the next president was, that they needed to focus on two, from the standpoint of terrorism, there were two sort of branches that needed to be rooted out. One was Imad Mughniya, and the second was Osama bin Laden. And so we laid out, some of the evidence and what made them deserving of attention. And then George W. Bush takes over, and there was zero interest in responding to the potential threat that the Al-Qaeda crowd posed. I know that Richard Clarke had written an extensive memorandum that was just ignored. And so during that entire, ensuing 9 months up until the September 10th of 2001, the Bush administration refused to even take the potential threat of this of terrorism from Al Qaeda seriously. And it wasn't so much bin Laden as it was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I mean, the guy was a genius.
Yeah.
I give him real credit for being a visionary, albeit a malevolent one. And because he'd come up with the first attack on the World Trade Center in '93, and then the Bojinka plot, and then blowing up the 2 embassies in East Africa and the USS. I mean,
USS Cole. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was quite the thing. And it was only then on September 11th where the cover their ass strategy kicked in. Because they had the intelligence, they just ignored the intelligence, and they had no desire to do anything about the policy. And then after that, as you pointed out, create the reason to go into Iraq as being, to stop terrorism when it was nothing but oil, about oil.
Exactly. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think there was probably a reason to kind of go into Afghanistan, albeit not for as long as they did. From my recollection, there's actually no kind of evidence really to justify going in on Iraq.
I was friends with. He wrote under the pen name Dalton Fury, Tom Greer, who was a Delta Force operator. He sadly died 10 years ago. He came down with cancer, died way too young. But they were there to, if you will, entrap and get their hands on bin Laden. And when they requested a blocking force of the 75th Rangers, Tommy Franks turned it down because Bush turned it down. They had no interest in that. And then, what ensued, both in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, was the, if you will, the beginning of the dismantling of the myth of American supremacy.
Well, absolutely. Actually, if you fast forward to today, that kind of weakening of the US's credibility as a global player is playing out today in Israel, Gaza, and in Russia and Ukraine, of course. Because when you strip away the rhetoric, the US has proven itself, is proving itself to be a bit of a toothless tiger, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah.
Keen to whip up tensions, unwilling to kind of go in to stop them when they emerge into kind of hot conflicts, and unable actually to kind of really control their, to use the kind of Ramzan Kadyrov, Anna Politkovskaya, kind of, the small dragons that they create, the Zelenskys and Netanyahus, they give these people birth, give them oxygen, feed them, fatten them up, and then can't control them when they get too strong.
Right. Well, how's it been perceived, both from your point of view, and maybe you can draw some broader conclusions about the political class in the UK, the Operation Prosperity Guardian, or Guardian Prosperity, the one where the United States was going to reopen the Red Sea and stop those damn Houthis from stopping maritime traffic. And here we are, almost 10 months later, complete failure.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, if you take this back to, Russia and Ukraine, just for the context, the millions of rounds of artillery and ballistic munitions and other munitions that have been deployed to get both sides not very far. I mean, obviously the Russians have the upper hand and they're making kind of around a few missile strikes, on Houthis, and it means nothing at all. It doesn't really address the underlying, cause of the tension. The Houthis, what they're doing clearly is a response to what they see as actively sponsored by the US and UK and other states, kind of Israeli genocide, in Gaza, and them, aligning themselves as essentially a proxy of Iran, with that wider axis of resistance to kind of, undermine the infidel West. So dealing with it as a tactical matter, by kind of sending in a few kind of missile strikes isn't really solving the problem.
Right. Well, you've got to wonder that at some point, other countries sitting there watching, okay, the United States got run out of Afghanistan. We were unable to really quell the situation in Iraq. And now we've been unable to squash the Houthis. And the Red Sea is effectively closed, and the Eilat port in southern Israel is shut, but it's shattered from bankruptcy.
They've only got one port left open, I believe, Israel. Is that correct?
Yeah, out on the Mediterranean side. So, you've got to step back and say the image of the all-powerful, the superpower of America is getting tarnished a bit anyway.
Well, because we're unwilling to use the power, that's the problem. We're kind of sponsoring these conflicts, but then when push comes to shove, we're unwilling actually to kind of lean in militarily before it gets out of control. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. If we'd really wanted to, push the separatists out of Donbass, NATO could had it, chosen to do so, done that in 2014. It's too late to do it now in 2022. Drip feeding sort of incrementalism that we've seen under Jake Sullivan and the likes of dreamers like him actually miss the point that, if you want to kind of, don't talk about sort of military solutions. If you want a military solution, do it right at the start, not towards the end of the game,
Well, I wonder,
because that actually, you're not really kind of, you're going in when it's too late anyway. And more importantly, for adversaries like Russia and China, you're making yourself look weak.
Well, yeah, I've been pretty outspoken of late over trying to shut down the different fantastical memes that are being pushed out of the West. As an example, to portray Russia as this imperial power.
Oh, yes, it's bonkers. But that's not new. I mean, that's been going for the past decade.
Well,
and Zelensky, who's the ultimate sort of communicator, right? I mean, he's really a PR guy, not really a politician, I think.
Well, don't forget his prowess as a musician playing the piano.
Yes, he's a good penis. So he's a good penis, a pianist. So a penis pianist. Try and say that when you drive.
Yeah.
Good penis pianist.
A couple of shots at Guinness and you can't pronounce it.
No. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the Ukrainian propaganda machine is almost more kind of intensive than ours. It's quite remarkable. I mean, the Ukrainian state even tried to cancel a Bobby Brown US brand name lipstick once because it had the word Russia in the name. They had one of their lipstick. I didn't use lipstick, but my wife does. Called Russian Red or something like that. And the Ukrainians went on the offensive to say, "Wow, how can you name your lipstick after a terrorist country?" And all it is incredible. I mean, the propaganda machine, and of course, is very active on the Russian side too. Of course, it is. But going back to the point that you first made, Russia's an imperialist. That then drives kind of all these comic kind of notions that actually Russia's about to invade, NATO, a NATO country. Russian tanks will roll into Riga or Tallinn or Vilnius, but probably before breakfast tomorrow, because Putin's that strong, even though actually the Russian army is bogged down in the Donbass, 1,200 kilometers from the Polish border.
NATO certainly seems they need a good editor, if nothing else, to try to enforce some consistency in the argument. Yeah. Because on the one hand, they're saying, Russia's bringing in the North Koreans. The North Koreans, because Russia's bogged down, they've suffered so many losses. They're so weakened. They got to have the North Koreans just to stay in the fight. And then like in the next breath, and by the way, we got to stop Russia because if we don't, they're going to take over Europe. And it's like, Okay, now
Hold on,
which is it?
yeah, exactly.
They're either bogged down and weakened, or they
Or they're
are
about to invade.
Superman. You know.
Yeah. It's all totally bonkers. And this idea that the other idea is that NATO, because it's all self-serving RTX or whatever it's called, and Rheinmetall and Northrop Grumman and all these BAE systems and those sorts of things. We need to kind of spend even more on defense. Even Trump is big on this too, right?
Yes.
Actually, NATO spends 10 times more on defense than Russia.
Yeah.
Even with some of the laggards in Europe spending under their 2% mark. Even then, Europe alone spends 4 times more on defense than Russia. The European, including Turkey, NATO countries, they spend 4 times more on defense, than Russia. Across the board, we have 5 times more troops, 4 times more sort of planes, ships, systems. A lot of our systems, all of them, are more sophisticated and better than the Russian ones. What are we missing here? Russia, and I think I've actually heard Putin say this before, that actually, they would be completely mad, to kind of take on NATO. They're as scared as us as we are of them.
Well, do you see any way? Because let me give you the my projection that this mess will end within the next 6 months, if not sooner, and Russia will prevail. Is there what will it take to get relations back on track between London and Moscow, Washington and Moscow, or is that an impossible dream?
Well, I agree with you that Russia will prevail. I hope, and I probably actually am inclined to agree that it will end in the next 6 months, as much as anything else, because the Ukrainians are just going to run out of money and men. Fight. Even if Comrade Kamala, as Trump rather unfairly calls her, gets it into power. I think even if she gets into power, the US system is going to have to take stock. And the Zelensky machine is falling apart, as we're watching in real time at the moment, with his increasingly kind of fantastical demands and insults thrown at various kind of international leaders. So I think the tide is turning against him. He's losing massively on the battlefield. The Russian offensive seems to be accelerating slightly at the moment, particularly from the south. They're pushed north and that sort of thing. So 6 months feels to me about right. Hopefully, kind of sooner. Easier for the US to reset relations with Russia than us. Again, depending on whether Kamala gets in, or Trump. Probably easier with Trump because he has that hinterland with Putin already. Even though actually US-Russia relations tanked during Trump's time, that was largely down to dynamics on the Hill itself, more than about Trump. Trump actually did work to build some sort of personal rapport with Putin. I think that will actually matter to Putin. I think Kamala, who's been insulting Putin for the whole kind of presidential campaign, will find it harder to kind of build a sort of relationship, with Putin. But the Russians still ultimately, more than anybody else, want to talk to the Americans. Even if not economically or in terms of conventional military terms, as a kind of nuclear power, they do see, the US as their main peer, rival there, and the people they want most to kind of engage in dialogue with. So even if Kamala's in, I think it'd be easier to reset. In the UK, I see no prospect anytime soon. Back in 2014, I remember talking to somebody in the Russian system, and they said, well, it was going to take a decade. That was in 2014. All the trust is gone. Well, now there's even less trust than there was, then the Starmer and Larry's in the government. They've been just saying an even more extreme version of what their predecessors were in the absence of any ideas of their own. And in any case, the Russians actually kind of will much sooner talk to the Germans and the French. They just see the UK as poodles of the Americans in any case, particularly since we've left the EU. So, easiest for the Americans to reset, mostly easy if it's Trump more than Kamala, but still not impossible. They'll talk to kind of, even though they hate him, Macron and Schultz, a long time before they talk to us.
Okay. I think a fair answer. I will, again, encourage people to take a look at and buy your book, Misfit in Moscow.
Thank you very much.
I always appreciate talking to misfits in the unconventional. you know.
Let's do this again.
We will. Ian, thank you so much for your time. I hopefully I didn't interrupt your dinner. Maybe you're a late eater, a la European style.
Yeah, no, I remember coming to driving up from DC, actually up to Canada once, and having quite like Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria, not far from DC, and taking my parents for dinner there, and it's like 8 o'clock at night. And the place was closing up shop. I thought, what the hell's going on? Why do Americans eat so early? Well, there you go.
Yeah, I lived in Argentina. It was considered impolite to eat before 9 p.m.
Why, indeed.
So, all right, my friend. Thanks so much.
All the best, Larry. Nice to meet you.
This will probably take 2 or 3 days to get up, but I'll keep you notified.
No worries. All the best. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Countercurrents and my interview with Ian Proud. As you can see, Ian brings a unique perspective to the events that are unfolding in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the Middle East. Thanks for listening. Hit the like and subscribe button. I'm Larry Johnson.